If you glanced up into a clear southern German sky in the 1950s, then the chances are that you would spot contrails high above you. Look more closely and you might pick out dancing silvery shapes, falling and rising, turning and twisting in the blue. If you were lucky, maybe one of those shapes would race past you at the bottom of a daring dive before barreling up and back into the fight. One fighter owned these skies in the late 1950s and through into the early 1960s, the Canadair Sabre, a NATO fighter that hounded its allies and defied its advancing years. When it finally left the theatre, it would also leave a gap unfilled even by the technological terrors that had succeeded it. It was not until the F-15 that a true air superiority fighter would return to European skies once more. This is the story of Canada's darting Silver Sabre. It is also an examination of its claim to be the ultimate example of its breed. I imagine some controversy will ensue. Canada was one of the initiators of NATO in 1949. As a founder member, it needed to deploy forces to Europe to serve alongside its allies as a backstop to perceived Soviet expansionism. This posed a problem for the Royal Canadian Air Force. The RCAF had been an early adopter of jet fighters. Their chosen platform was the robust and cost-effective de Havilland Vampire. Although a neat design and a clear step up from props and pistons, the Vampire was clearly obsolete by 1949. Its suitability as a frontline defender of NATO was marginal at best. Canada's traditional partner in aircraft procurement was Great Britain. However, the British aircraft industry was at the beginning of its long and sad decline. The only thing it could offer was the straight-winged Meteor F-8 and Hawker Seahawk, or the promise of a Hawker Hunter sometime in the coming decade. Fortunately, there was another option closer to home. By 1949, it was very clear that North American aviation had another winner on its hands with the F-86. Since the RCAF wanted a very large number of aircraft to supply its burgeoning needs, Canadair was tasked with negotiating a licensing agreement with North American that entailed the supply of around 46,000 drawings both for the aircraft and for some of the key machine tools needed to make it. This latter point can't be underplayed. North American aviation were more than just brilliant designers. In some ways, their real genius lay in the ways that they designed the machines that mass-produced complex parts like the Sabre wing skins. To this point, 90% of the parts used to assemble the first batch of 100 F-86As made in Canada were shipped in from North American Aviation's factory to Cartierville near Montreal for final assembly. By the end of the Canadair Sabre's long production run, this situation would nearly be reversed, with 85% of the components being made in Canada. The procurement decision caused a degree of outrage in a section of the Canadian political establishment. A campaign in the Toronto media, always happy to throw shade at Montreal, accompanied their buy-British fervour. The centre of the campaign was the relatively high cost of Sabres versus de Havilland Vampires. For the same cost as the initially mooted 130 Sabres, the Royal Canadian Air Force could have 800 Vampires. I'm of the opinion that 130 Sabres would likely beat 800 Vampires in any sort of conflict, but that's a duck-sized horses versus horse-sized ducks kind of debate. At one point, it was even claimed that the Vampire was the world's top performance fighter in 1949. Yeah. Fortunately, common sense prevailed. The first Canadian Sabre was an identical copy of the F-86A5 and was designated CL-13 Sabre Mark.1. Apparently, this was a stipulation from the US DoD requiring for them to give permission for the $1 million license. Given that it was identical, I'll link to a previous video on the American Sabre if you want more details on that model. The short summary is that it has a wing with leading-edge slats plumbed for drop tanks and an A1CM gun sight using the AN/APG-30 radar for ranging. Firepower is in the form of 650 caliber machine guns, and engine power is from a J47 GE13 producing 5,200 pounds of thrust. While the negotiations were happening and the factory being set up, North American had developed the F-86E, which featured many improvements over the early model. Most notable was the all-flying tail, which greatly improved transonic stability and manoeuvrability in general. Some consideration was also apparently given to purchasing the radar-equipped F-86D, but this was quickly shelved. Remarkably, the first Canadian copy of the F-86E, the CL-13 Mark II, flew only a month after the first US-produced example. So by the end of 1950, Canadair was also churning out the first of 350 Mark IIs. Some small changes that North American introduced were also incorporated into the Mark II during the run, so some of these aircraft have the flat windshield first seen on the F-86E-10. In 1952, a slightly improved version emerged designated Mark IV. This included some changes in the details, such as the compass, cabin air conditioning pressurization, and the canopy release mechanism. The latter was an issue that all Sabre users had encountered. As designed, the canopy could only be jettisoned during the ejection sequence, but if the aircraft barely landed and the pilot wanted to get out, he didn't want to eject as well. Separating the system helped, but in truth the jettison system was never really perfected, and pilots were killed during ejection sequences when the canopy didn't clear out of the way fast enough. You might be wondering what happened to the Mark III. Well, as production continued, Arenda engines were working on an alternative power plant to the J-47, supply of which was always very tight because it was installed in a variety of contemporary US aircraft. Their prototype engine was installed into the 100th production aircraft and was designated Mark III. Giving 6,000 pounds of thrust, what became the Arenda 10 gave the Sabre a useful performance boost. Although the initial intention had been to fit them to the Mark IV, a desire to maintain commonality with Sabres being sent to Korea led to Canadair sticking with the J-47 for that version. The Arenda's debut was therefore delayed until the Mark V, which also featured the F-86 F-25 6.3 wing. This, to remind you, is extended 6 inches at the root and 3 inches at the tip, and deletes the leading edge slats to reduce drag and improve high-altitude performance. The cost of these changes is higher stall speed and reduced predictability at lower speeds, but given the combat conditions in Korea, this was regarded as a fair exchange by pilots. The production Arenda 10 gave this version 6,355 pounds of force versus just over 6,000 in the current version of the J-47. Climb rate with the combination of new wing and new engine was twice as fast as the Mark II. The Mark V reached 40,000 feet in 9 minutes, half the time of its predecessor. The cost of the larger wing and the structural changes needed to mount the Arenda engine was an increase in empty weight from 11,000 to 11,365 pounds. 370 of these aircraft were produced, with the run ending in late 1954. All of this set the scene for the Mark VI. There were 2 major changes between the Mark V and the Mark VI. The first was the installation of the new Arenda 14 engine. This produced a whopping 7,275 pounds of thrust and was a lovely, smooth and reliable power unit by all accounts. Modern sources have the Arenda 14 producing 7,500 pounds of thrust, but this conflicts with the in-period data sources. I'm not sure whether there's been later retesting of Arenda 14's output, but I've not found an actual source to that effect. An interesting point about the installation of the Arenda in the F-86 is that whereas on the earlier transatlantic flights the J-47 powered Sabres had only about 5 minutes of fuel left even when carrying 2 drop tanks, on the 778-mile leg from Goose Bay to Blue West 1, Greenland, this was increased to some 15 minutes for the Sabre 5 and even more for the Sabre 6 because of their improved specific fuel consumption. Despite its greatly increased thrust, the Sabre 6, with 2 120-gallon drop tanks, has the same range as the Mark V with 2 200-gallon external tanks. Each of the 700-mile transatlantic legs therefore took about an hour and a quarter for the Sabres, depending on wind conditions during the crossing. Another big change was to add slats to the 6.3 wing to improve low-speed handling characteristics at the expense of more drag at higher speeds. Otherwise, the Mark VI is the same as other Sabres, a hot-rodded power plant in one of the lightest versions of the aircraft. To give it the quick courtesy of a description, it is a low-winged, clear-air mass day fighter with a low-mounted swept wing of 35 and a bit degrees sweep back. This is matched by the sweep of the tail surfaces. The wing is fitted on a 3-degree dihedral, so the tips are slightly higher than the roots. The tail dihedral is 10 degrees. All control surfaces are powered, with feedback being provided to the pilot via a system of weights and pulleys that provide artificial feel. Full-length leading-edge slats deploy automatically depending on airspeed and angle of attack to improve low-speed handling. The Arenda 14 engine is supplied from 5 self-sealing fuel tanks, 2 in the fuselage, 1 in the wing center section and 1 in each outer wing panel. Fuel is supplied by gravity feed to the center section tank and is then pumped into the engine under pressure. For redundancy, there are 3 hydraulic systems. The normal system is powered by an engine-driven pump and operates the ailerons and tail surfaces. The alternate is based around an electrically driven pump and can be used in the event of a normal system failure. Finally, there is the utility system, which also operates off the engine and can supply the landing gear, speed brakes and wheel brakes. To protect the pilot, there is armour plate both ahead and behind the cockpit. You can maybe see why the Sabre proved so tough in Korea. Armament was typical of most Sabres: 6 50 caliber machine guns, 3 each side of the engine intake. Each has its own cassette magazine, able to hold 300 rounds, although the normal load was 267. Later modifications would enable the Mark 6 to employ the AIM-9B Sidewinder. 2 weapons could be carried, 1 on each inboard wing pylon. Although they look comically large on the diminutive Sabre, their carriage had negligible impact on performance. When they arrived in Europe at the end of 1956, they were the hottest aircraft the Alliance could muster, besides the on-paper capabilities of the F-100A, which would need to remain uncrashed long enough to actually use said capabilities in an actual conflict. The Canadian pilots were also tasked solely with air superiority, and they honed their skills on any passing NATO aircraft who could find time to have an impromptu scrap. For this reason, the reputation of both the Canadian pilots and the Mark 6 Sabre grew to epic proportions. Many books therefore have this as the ultimate Sabre. But is it really? Well, the case for it is based around the Mark 6's unique combination of lightweight and high power. Because Arenda 14 was slightly lighter than the J-47, it essentially weighs the same as an F-86E, but with 40% more power and thus the same wing loading. If you look at the statistics in isolation, then you have a 700 mph capable aircraft, some sources say 710, which isn't what's in the official manual and doesn't sound right given the transonic drag the airframe experiences. It climbs at 11,800 feet per minute from sea level and has the best power to weight of any Sabre. So that's it then, we're home and hosed. Well, obviously I'm too contrary for that. We should look at the other candidates for the ultimate Sabre. If we stick for now to ultimate meaning the best dogfighting aircraft, then I think we need to look at 3 alternatives. The ultimate J-47 Sabre was the F-40, based on the Japanese model built by Mitsubishi for the Self-Defense Force. The F-40 has a 6'3" wing but with slatted leading edges, extended by 12 inches at the tip to give the largest wing area of any Sabre model. That wing comes with added weight but greater area. So the F-40 has a marginally lower wing loading than the Mark 6 and greater lift, but substantially lower thrust to weight as it only has a 6,000 pound thrust J-47. The F-40 does have some advantages over the Mark 6 at high altitude, where the larger, finer wing should enable it to turn more effectively. However, the relative lack of power would probably negate any benefits from that arrangement, and therefore I think we can conclude that the Mark 6 is superior in most situations. So let's try again. The ultimate US Sabre, chronologically at least, was the F-86H Sabre Hog. Now, the Sabre Hog is so different from the standard Sabre that it should arguably be regarded as a different aircraft. But whereas I'm excluding all-weather Sabres from this comparison as they're genuinely completely different planes, I'm going to allow the Hog because I like it and I can. The Hog's J73 engine puts the Arenda firmly in its place. It develops nearly 9,000 pounds of thrust in a package that is also smaller and lighter. The issue with the J73 was the amount of air it needed to feed the turbine, which necessitated an increase in size of the original Sabre's fuselage. Because the Air Force wanted the Hog as a nuclear strike aircraft, they filled that space with fuel to increase range, leading to a big increase in weight. Empty, it weighs 3,000 pounds more than the Mark 6. Thrust to weight is therefore a little worse, although the Hog's big power means that it still climbs faster. It shares a wing with the F-40, but the Hog really was a low and medium altitude fighter. The other big change was in armament. Most, but not all, Sabre Hogs have 4 M39 20mm cannons in place of machine guns. This is an important change because it increases throw weight in a 3-second burst from about 15 pounds in the Mark 6 to 66 pounds in the Hog, and remember a proportion of that is explosive. Still, firepower is useless if the enemy is behind you, and unfortunately for the Hog, accounts by the National Guard pilots that flew it in Europe suggest that in their regular tussles with the Canadians, the Mark 6 always came out on top. Incidentally, if Ultimate encompassed fighter bomber capability, then the Sabre Hog was significantly superior in any attack context. It could carry more weapons further, and the cannons made it a much better option for strafing. But this is about air-to-air, and even then the Mark 6 is not quite over the line. There was another. On approximately the opposite side of the world from the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force also elected to buy Sabres. But while the Canadians produced well over 1,000 examples, exporting many to NATO allies, CAC and Australia produced a little over 100 Sabres in a 6-year production run. Their Avon Sabre also features a different engine, and you guessed it, it's the Rolls-Royce Avon. Fitting it led to a major structural change, but not to the extent found in the Hog. Whereas the Mark 6 went back to a slatted 6.3 wing, the Avon Sabre just has the normal aerodynamic hard-edge 6.3 wing in its Mark 32 version. It is also more powerful, although very slightly increased takeoff weight means marginally lower thrust to weight and marginally higher wing loading. But I'm not dismissing the Avon Sabre based on those slightly worse statistics, and I'm going to do that for 2 reasons. First, of course, the statistics aren't universal truths across the flight envelope. The purpose of the 6.3 wing without slats was to reduce drag and improve high-altitude manoeuvrability. The Mark 6 attempts to brute force through these problems, which works when carrying the kind of performance advantage it has over an F-86F or H. I don't think it would give much, if any, advantage against the Mark 32, however. In fact, at higher levels, I suspect the advantage might be the other way round. And if we were at combat weight, the CAC Sabre carries more internal fuel than the Mark 6, which is where the weight increase comes from. Burn them down to the same number of gallons and the weight difference is negligible. The balance is very fine between the 2 aircraft. If the fight is long, then it will likely devolve into one at lower and lower speeds and lower altitudes. In this regime, the Mark 6's wing slats give it lower stall speed and better turning performance, but then it has to have the fuel to sustain the fight. In essence, if the fighters are equivalent from a manoeuvrability perspective and the pilots have equal skill, things start to come down to other factors, particularly firepower. And this is where I think things are won and lost if we're talking ultimate sabres. As I mentioned, the Mark 6 puts down 15 pounds of bullets in a 3-second burst from 6 50 caliber machine guns. The Avon Sabre has 2 30mm Aden cannons. Each of these monsters fires 1,500 high-explosive shells a minute, giving a projectile weight of nearly 73 pounds in a 3-second burst. The Sabre was tough, but 3 or 4 hits from high-velocity explosive 30mm shells would likely see to its day. My view, then, is that objectively the ultimate air-to-air Sabre is the Mark 32, with the Mark 6 an exceptionally close second. I can imagine that opinion will cause me some problems at a later date. None of this, of course, makes the Canadair Sabre a bad aircraft. On the contrary, it was a justified success. Many hundreds were sold to export customers as an alternative to American-built Sabres, which were typically quite hard to get hold of due to the USAF's own insatiable demand for the type in the early 1950s. Outside of Canada, the biggest user of the early Marks was the RAAF, which acquired 428 Mark IVs between December 1952 and December 1953. Financed by the US and Canadian governments, many of these aircraft fought in Korea and were then returned to the US between 56 and 58 as Hawker Hunters entered RAAF service in large numbers. West Germany was the largest export customer for the Mark 6, operating 225 of these and 75 Mark 5s from 1957 to 1964. Some were retained for training, or more likely for joyriding, and only retired in the early 1980s. 90 Mark 6s were sold to Pakistan in 1966 from those German stocks. In Canadian service, the first Sabres made the Atlantic crossing in 1951. Eventually, a dozen squadrons would be stationed in Europe. Typically, those equipped with Mark IIs would trade up for 4s, 5s, and 6s as soon as they came available. The last operational Canadian Sabre was paid off on the 22nd of January 1970. Some were later converted to drones and expended as targets. Various proposals were made to improve performance still further. These were possible because of the depth and quality of understanding that Canadair had about the Sabre. No other licensee got anything close to that level. The Canadian aerospace industry was able to build both the aircraft and the engine within the same industrial base. No mean feat, even in the late 1950s. Notable amongst those proposals was the idea of fitting an afterburner for the Mark 6, which seemed to have some merit, but would ultimately have pushed up against the airframe's aerodynamic limits for little real benefit. Rather less credibly, an Armstrong-Siddeley Snarler rocket system was fitted to one prototype to increase climb rate and top speed. Totally mad. On the subject of drag, one intriguing prototype was made from the 21st Mark V build. This aircraft was modified with an area-ruled fuselage in an attempt to reduce transonic drag and perhaps enable the overpowered Mark VI to break the sound barrier in level flight. Sadly, the experiment was a failure and there was no meaningful impact on performance from the adjustments. That aircraft also met its end as a target drone at White Sands, an ignominious end to a tantalizing idea. Questionable innovations aside, the Canadian military aviation industry was approaching its peak in the middle to late 1950s. They had scale, money, and ideas to burn. In a tragically similar story to that which was about to hit Great Britain, what they lacked was political surety, vision, and will.